We all know the vibe of a sacred grove. The air gets colder, the music swells into a soft woodwind melody, and suddenly you're surrounded by trees that look older than time itself. In fantasy, the sacred grove is the ultimate time-out zone, a place where the world stops and the divine starts. But Andrew from Religion for Breakfast recently challenged us that these untouched relics aren't actually how sacred groves were in the real world. Real groves are messy, they are political, they are managed, and they are deeply social. Today, I want to take up that challenge that Andrew laid down on how to create more realistic groves. If you're a writer, a dungeon master, or a game designer, how do you take the reality of human-managed groves and inject them with the high-octane elements of fantasy, active gods, tangible magic, and non-human species? So, let's stop building groves that are just pretty backgrounds and start building them as the heart of a world's culture. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. First, let's start by discussing Andrew's video about what sacred groves are in our world today. I'm not going to rehash all of Andrew's video. I highly recommend you go watch that for a deep dive into the role sacred groves play in our world, and I'll link it in the information card. But I will summarize the main point and the challenge that he laid down for fantasy creators. Andrew's core argument is that our favorite fantasy stories, from the God's Woods of Westeros to the Lost Woods of Hyrule in Legend of Zelda, rely on relic theory. This is the idea that sacred groves are frozen remnants of a primeval, untouched past that exists entirely outside of human society. In these stories, the grove is sacred because it is pure nature, and humans are merely silent visitors or intruders. Andrew points out that while this creates a great vibe, it fundamentally misses how sacred spaces actually function in human history. In reality, sacred groves are socially constructed landscapes. Using examples from Tanzania and India, Andrew shows that these forests aren't sacred because they've been left alone. They are sacred because they are set apart by specific community rules, rituals, and taboos. Whether it's a village in South India managing a forest dedicated to a fierce deity, or a Tanzanian clan planting trees to mark their ancestral lands, these groves are living parts of a social and political system. They are often managed, pruned, and protected by the very people the relic theory ignores. The takeaway for us is that sacredness is a human product. When we see a biodiverse shrine forest in Japan, it's often the result of centuries of ritual sweeping and deliberate planting, not accidental survival of some species of trees. So we need to shift our perspective from untouched nature to socially managed sanctuary, and then we can move past the tropes and start building fantasy worlds where sacred groves are sites of political tension, communal ownership, and active cultural negotiation. In the spirit of that challenge, I am going to tackle the various ways in which fantasy elements can impact sacred groves. And let's start with, what if the gods the groves are dedicated to are present and active? In our world, the presence of a god or spirit in a grove is a matter of faith. But in a fantasy world, we have our own metaphysics, and stuff can get very, very real, including your gods. If a god literally dwells in a thicket, the social maintenance Andrew talked about might become anything from a survival tactic to a vending machine strategy. Vending machine in this case being put in ritual worship, get out blessing. Imagine a grove dedicated to a fierce deity like the ones in Tamil Nadu. In a fantasy setting, this god doesn't just symbolically protect the village, they provide a tangible divine shield against monsters. But that shield has a subscription fee. The community's bond with the grove in such a case could be an actual divine contract. By the way, absolutely ages ago, I made a video about contract magic and how that would work, which you can check out in the information card. Anyway, if you have a deity in a grove, you have a few things to consider about how to construct that grove. First is the ritual burden. The god might derive specific power from rituals performed in the grove, and if those rituals are neglected, like if the grove isn't maintained, the god's presence might sour. This could mean anything from the grove becoming corrupted and hostile, to the blessings of the god being withdrawn, to an apocalypse hitting the surrounding communities and destroying their way of life. Such neglect and subsequent corruption can of course be an amazing launchpad for a fantasy story. Your hero battling the corruption of the grove. Secondly, the grove could serve as a divine mirror. The health of the grove could reflect the health of the god, or even the moral health of the community. If the village elders grow corrupt, maybe the leaves of the grove turn black, indicating that there is some terrible problem with the relationship of the community and the god. Or there might even be something wrong with the god, like some kind of divine sniffles, and this could make the flowers in the grove lose their petals, despite the care being lavished on them by the guardians of the grove. And of course, that again can be a great launching pad for a story where you have a fetch quest to get the god some divine cough medicine or whatever. So, long story short, if you have an active spirit or divine entity in a grove, you can use something like contract magic to bind the community to the maintenance of the grove in return for the god's blessing, protection, or even tolerance. As in, the god won't eat people if they keep the grove tidy. But not everyone likes direct divine presence in their story, and gods being present are not the only way fantasy might impact the grove. So next, let's turn to magic. Real-world groves often allow for the gathering of fallen wood or medicinal herbs in their environment. This lays the groundwork for even more potential in a fantasy world, especially in a natural world magic system, which I also made a video about, and you can check that out in the information card. But to get specific regarding Andrew's video about sacred groves, in fantasy, we can turn magical components harvested from the grove into an arcane economy. Instead of just being a place that you visit, a sacred grove could be the only source of the world's most potent arcane components. Mages could travel from far and wide to harvest the components, to the point where the guardians of the grove have a queuing system, and mages might have to wait for years to gain access. Or very wealthy mages could buy their way to the top of the grove's queue, and this could lead to all kinds of fun and games. Consider if the grove has something like star oak that only drops a few acorns every year, or even worse, every decade. At this point, you might not be talking about a queue, but instead you might be talking about a political situation of note. Armies might form up around the sacred grove in order to get hold of the specific harvest item that is so very rare and so very valuable. And again, a great launching pad for a fantasy story. But it's not just components that can be found in a grove. What about training or laboratory work? What if these groves have risen around a place where mages get specific training or undergo tests because of their location? So same as with Andrew's real-world examples, the groves would come to exist in places of power, in places of cultural power. And students of magic might travel to the groves to study with a specific spirit or perhaps to undergo a trial in order to achieve a new tier of magic within your magic system. The grove could even provide a magical laboratory of some kind, a place where a spell's power is increased because it is cast here. And you could treat this somewhat like we treat mainframes back in the past. So back in the days of yore, when computers still filled a whole room, it worked like this. A computer person, and back then, in those days, they were often women and sometimes secretaries. Sometimes mathematicians, but often secretaries. And yes, that's really true. Men only started coding in the 70s or so. Anyway, so a computer person designed a program using index cards with holes punched into them to tell the logical gates of the computer where to open and close to make the computer do its thing. I could go into more detail, but I don't want to put you to sleep. Anyway, you couldn't just feed your punch cards into the machine any old time. You needed to schedule time for your program to be compiled and run, and then you would get the output of that program normally printed out on paper. This persisted even with Fortran programs created on floppy disks and so on. So, programmers scheduled time to run their programs and crunch their numbers, and the most junior sods got the graveyard shift, needing to run their programs in the middle of the night. You could use the same kind of scheduling for a grove. Oh, so you're a poor mage with no money and less experience? Yeah, you get access to the grove on New Year's night when everyone else is having a party. I actually used a kind of grove concept in my magic system in Sangwheel Chronicles. In the world of Sangwheel, my high mages all need to survive a trial of Dusang in a Dusang cave, and the location of these caves became the capital cities of my duchies in the Empire of Lumiaron. And this is one of the reasons why the capital of La Roche, the northernmost duchy, is in the most god-awful location on the map. The spirit that teaches northern mages was located above the Arctic Circle, and it wouldn't be moved. So there we go. There's a capital circle way up in the north. My world is all about politics and magic and gods and the slippery slope of the means justifying the ends. And if that sounds interesting to you, you can buy the digital box set on my website right now. That includes all 4 books and 8 pieces of digital character art, which you get as high-resolution JPEGs, including this one that shows you an actual Dusang trial in a cave. And I'll even throw in a discount. The first 20 people who use the code GROVE2026 will get 20% discount on the box set. Check all that out in the links down below. And now, let's move on to spirits and magic and talk about the impact of non-human peoples on sacred groves. In his video, Andrew mentioned how the Tanzanian government's attempt to plant trees was seen as a political takeover. This was because whoever plants a tree has a claim on the land of the grove. So it was a case of cultural mismatch, right? I mean, that's simple to understand. But now, add elves, fairies, or dryads to that mix. You could end up with epic cultural clashes or carefully worked out treaties between fantasy peoples around the maintenance and use of groves. You could have farmlands that the humans need, a buffer zone of wildish lands, and then the groves maintained by the fairy community who need far wilder areas to maintain their magic. And that could create enormous tensions. You might have humans eating into the buffer zone, or even fairies eating into the buffer zone, making the woods wilder and less safe for humans. You could also play around with syncretism between the cultures. If a human community lives near a fairy grove for centuries, their culture might begin to mimic fairy lore. They might start to change to match fairy taboos, not out of worship per se, but out of a practical need to not get turned into a toad when they enter the fairy grove. And so, humans could become part of the guardians of the grove. Or they might set up their own groves that don't have the same power, but are culturally significant. Or you could set up a shared resource scenario where humans provide order by clearing invasive species or protecting against fire, while the Fae provide vitality, which is accelerated crop growth. If one side fails, the whole ecosystem then collapses. This turns the grove into a site of interspecies diplomacy, which I also made a video about that you can check out in the information card. How would you set up a multi-species grove in your world? Let me know in the comments below. And let's talk about possibly my two favorite groves in fantasy writing as a practical example. There are two great examples of groves in fantasy writing. The first I want to highlight is Elizabeth Moon's Deed of Paxenarion. When Pax goes into a state of what we might today call PTSD, she spends time in a grove maintained by a Kukgan, a druidic priest near the town of Brewer's Bridge. In this grove, she is healed not so much by magic as by the slow peace of the druid grove and the care of the Kukgan. It was one of the best depictions of PTSD I have ever seen in fantasy, and the grove and her healing process there was incredibly well done. Indeed, the grove in Brewer's Bridge is a fantastic example of what Andrew spoke about. It wasn't an untouched relic. It was very much a working part of the community of Brewer's Bridge. The Kukgan provides healing and advice to the town, and in return, the town respects the grove's boundaries. The grove is described as having specific paths and clearings and plants. It is tended. It's not a wild jungle. It is a natural temple. And those who need the Kukgan's advice give donations and gifts that allow the Kukgan's needs to be met. It is a grove that has natural magic, but is also surrounded by social rules and well maintained by its guardian. So if you're looking for a great example of a fantasy grove done well, check out Deed of Paxenarion. The grove is in book 2 and 3 of the trilogy. My second example is from Jacqueline Carey. In the Morin books, we encounter the groves of Alba that are maintained by the Bear Witches. The groves we found in Morin's trilogy are dedicated to the Magnu Albus, and the main character's Diwa, her inner spark, is directly tied to the divine presence in these groves. Thus, the groves aren't just a place of prayer, it is a charging station for her specific magical abilities. Now, she can recharge in any wild and green place, but the groves allow for a far deeper recharge of her magic and connection with her culture. And unlike the untouched woods of Zelda, Morin's home grove is part of her community's daily life. It has a designated caretaker, her mother, the Magaduin priestess, and this supports Andrew's point. The grove stays sacred because a specific person performs specific labors like rituals, protection, and meditation, and that keeps the grove's vibe active. I really enjoyed Morin's trilogy. It was a very fun read that took us all over Jacqueline's world, so I really recommend it as a book. The grove in this case appears a lot in book 1 and somewhat in book 3. Sacred groves are more than just vibes and floaty lights and untouched wilderness. It is certainly more than relics of a different time. They are the places where a fantasy world's physics, politics, and religion meet. So when you're building your grove, don't just figure out the magic or divinity of it. Also consider the communities it creates, the cultural taboos that arise, and the politics created by the grove. And now, while the names of the amazing members of the channel scroll past, let me tell you about an idea that I had while thinking about this video. I've written an urban fantasy novel, which won the Flash 500 novel opening competition, so, I'm quite proud of it. And the main character in that novel is a druid living in Las Vegas. And researching this video and thinking about creating the groves got me thinking about that world. It's not published yet, so don't go looking for it. Anyway, I think in book 2 of that series, I might have sacred groves play into the story a little. There isn't really space for them in book 1. The story moves at 1,000,000 miles per hour and is centered on a stolen artifact. But in the next book, I think there could be real opportunity to not only create a grove, but have some tension around the grove. So Lily actually comes from Boston, and she's been living in Vegas for something like 4 years now. And I could pull some tension strings in book 2 by having her think something like, damn, it's time to create a grove. But creating a grove means I really live here now. I'm no longer a Bostonian. I'm now part of Las Vegas. So the grove could become a way to have her cross a threshold where she stops thinking of herself as a Bostonian and starts thinking of herself as a Vegas native. I think I quite like that idea, and I might very well use that, and then of course create a whole community around that grove. If you made it this far, leave a tree emoji in the comments, and don't forget to hype or thumbs up, or both if you're feeling generous, the video.